All right, John, if you're all set, we'll get going. Well, I want to welcome everyone to the RCR Wireless News Indoor DAS webinar. I am Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of RCR Wireless News. And today I will be joined by John Spindler from TE Connectivity, Ryan Ray from Connectivity Wireless Solutions, and Joe Maddon with Mobile Experts to take a closer look at the current indoor DAS market in the shadow of the upcoming Republican and Democratic conventions scheduled for later this year. This year's political conventions are expected to be a grueling test for mobile networks. This is said to be the first real presidential election or conventions to feel the onslaught of the mobile data and smartphone revolution. Carriers and their infrastructure providers and partners have luckily had several years in which they have been able to monitor and adapt to such influxes of consumer usage in confined spaces, though these political conventions are sure to push that experience to the limit. While carriers have traditionally relied on optimized macro sites and temporary solutions for these sort of events, for this year's events, I think a broader emphasis has been placed on embedded solutions using small cell technologies. As one of the more advanced solutions on the market, distributed antenna systems have been deployed and will be relied upon at the supporting venues to ensure that attendees are able to keep in touch as well as inform those people not attending on the latest information coming from the event. The plan for today's 1-hour webinar is to cover a handful of topics concerning the indoor DAS space and provide some context as to how the space is evolving, challenges impacting the space, and how indoor DAS is set to play a significant role in the upcoming political conventions. For additional follow-up, we'll be releasing a report on this subject this week that will be available on the rcrwireless.com website. For those that may have stumbled upon RCR Wireless News looking to get some more information on indoor DAS, here is a slide with some background on RCR Wireless News. We've been covering the mobile space for more than 30 years and have a lengthy history in covering the growth in the indoor DAS market. As I mentioned earlier, joining me on today's call is John Spindler from TE Connectivity. John, thanks for joining us today. Would you please give a quick background on yourself and also TE Connectivity, please?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you happen to be. As Dan said, my name is John Spindler. I am the Director of Product Management for TE Connectivity's in-building wireless product portfolio. I've been working in the in-building wireless space for approximately 15 years now, the last 13 of which have been spent with TE Connectivity. And prior to that, I was actually with Nortel Networks for about 13 years, working in both the PBX and the wireless space. So that's a little bit about my background. TE Connectivity is a large multi-billion-dollar company, about $12 billion in revenues, with over 100,000 employees in multiple business segments, including things like automotive, aerospace, consumer electronics, but also in the wireless space, obviously. The wireless business unit is a part of a larger unit called Network Solutions that provides connectivity products for standard telecom as well as wireless applications.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Also joining us today is Ryan Ray from Connectivity Wireless Solutions. Ryan, thanks for taking the time. And would you please also give a quick background on yourself and also on Connectivity Wireless?
Sure. Once again, this is Ryan Ray. I'm Director for the Midwest and Northeast markets for Connectivity Wireless Solutions. And we are a nationwide turnkey vendor who specializes specifically in IDAS, or if you will, in-building DAS. We are a nationwide player, and our clients include obviously the major carriers such as AT&T, Sprint, Nextel, T-Mobile, and Verizon. And we also have relationships with our enterprise class clients where we go directly to them to serve them from a DAS standpoint. My background, I've been with Connectivity since its inception. actually, but before that I was a engineer with a major carrier, initially on the macro side from the cell tower network, and then managed their in-building group. So I've been in this space for over a decade now, and watched the growth specifically over the last 10 years into what it is today and what it will be over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Ryan. Appreciate it. And finally, to bring a bit of an analytical perspective on the indoor DAS market, we are joined by Joe Maddon from Mobile Experts. Joe, thanks for joining us today. And also, would you please give us a quick background and some information on Mobile Experts?
Okay, thank you, Dan, and hi, everybody. This is Joe Maddon. I have been working in mobile communications for over 20 years and did a couple of startup companies in radio equipment for base stations through the 90s and the 2000s. And I actually founded Mobile Experts in 2003, originally called Madden Consulting, but we changed the name over the years as I added a few partners in, and we started publishing market research looking at specifically at the radio base stations and the DAS market, and trying to make some projections about where the future's headed. We've got a few forecasts that you can find on our website and things that go into very great detail in terms of trying to cover not just top-level metrics such as the DAS revenue out there, but to get down to specifics about the equipment and even which frequency bands will be covered by things like base stations or DAS networks, and taking it down to a detail level so that equipment developers can use our forecast for product planning.
Got it. That sounds great. Well, Joe, thanks so much for joining us today. And as I mentioned, we plan on covering a handful of topics today, including an overview on the state of the indoor DAS market, looking at how DAS fits into the indoor wireless ecosystem and challenges that may lay ahead for the indoor DAS market. We'll plan on leaving about 15 minutes or so at the end of the presentation for questions from those of you listening in. Please feel free to use the question function there on the GoToWebinar tab that should be on your screen to send in those questions, and we will try to get to as many questions at the end as possible. If you have a question for a specific member of the panel, if you want to put their name in the beginning of the question, we can kind of try to target that question as much as we can. And for those of you that might be having any sort of audio difficulties, we do get that question quite a bit. We will try to speak as loud as we can, but please make sure to check your audio settings on your computer. We've often found that sometimes is part of the case for some of the audio issues. So we'll try to hopefully help you with that if we can. All right. So to begin with, I did want to show a quick video clip getting some insight into AT&T's DAS deployment at the Time Warner Cable Arena in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Democratic National Convention is going to be held. So hopefully this will work smoothly and won't crash the system.
So we'll be covering the Democratic National Convention. We've installed 12 new cell sites. We've got distributed antenna systems around town, 12 of them outside and 10 indoors. We've also got 4G LTE wireless service that we installed in November. In addition to that, we have the first ever outdoor distributed antenna system that will be servicing the Time Warner Cable Arena. In all total, we've made more than 400 wireless upgrades in 2011.
So as you can see, the carriers are definitely very involved in kind of preparing for these conventions. AT&T obviously as the official wireless supplier for the Democratic Convention in Charlotte is definitely kind of taking the lead on providing, making sure that there's enough capacity and coverage for this event. So with that, we will get to our topics for today. So the first topic, as you can see there, is just getting, I guess, a general overview of the state of the indoor DAS market. Maybe looking at, where are we today with indoor DAS? Are we still in the early days, or with room to grow, or is the market mature and stable? And perhaps some insight from our panel members on maybe what's next for DAS. And then for those who've been kind of working on the convention front, maybe the importance for indoor DAS to perform well at the DNC and RNC. So maybe start with John. If John, if you want to give maybe a quick overview of your view, I guess, on kind of where we are with the indoor DAS market and some of these other topics here on the state of the indoor DAS market.
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, indoor DAS has kind of, if you will, been a well-kept secret for a number of years. People have been deploying primarily carriers' indoor DAS solutions for the better part of 10 years or more. But it's really come to the forefront in the last couple of years. And the growth in indoor DAS has been almost exponential in kind of the 2010, 2011, and leading into this year time frame. Much of that, and I think we'll maybe discuss this later in the webinar, has been around a few key drivers. Number one, of course, is the move from 2G to 3G to 4G LTE, and the corresponding emphasis on data and a shift from primarily voice usage to data usage. The other thing to think about is also just the adoption of smartphones and other devices which are better geared towards different data uses, email, texting, video clips, web surfing, all of that, which drives massive capacity needs on the carrier's networks. Those capacity needs are also what has shifted the need for DAS into high gear, because traditionally DAS was used as a coverage solution because somebody couldn't get coverage in their basement or someplace like that where the outdoor macro cellular signal simply could not penetrate. But more and more now, DAS has been used as both coverage and to deliver capacity in association with a connected base station of some sort with the DAS. And when you begin to look at these kinds of venues like the Time Warner Arena in Charlotte or the St. Pete Times Forum down in Tampa, really what's happening there is a desire to be able to meet the capacity needs of all of those attending the RNC and the DNC, not just the delegates themselves, but of course a huge amount of press, security, etc. So you've got a large concentration of users in these venues, all requiring capacity, and it's not just about making a voice call anymore. In fact, in these kinds of events, it's actually more about delivering on the data side of things. So I wouldn't actually characterize the DAS business as in the early days. That was probably a few years ago, but I certainly believe that there's still plenty of room for the DAS business to grow. And that's because I think DAS is very much a key element of the small cell ecosystem that's being discussed today. And while you read a lot in the press and other places about small cell in relationship to primarily delivery of femtos or picos, in fact, I like to tell people that, you know, DAS, we were doing small cell before small cell was really cool to talk about. Because that is, in fact, what DAS is its delivery of a small cell architecture. It is a relatively stable technology today. It has been around for some time, but there's plenty of new evolutions occurring within the DAS marketplace. Obviously, moving towards support of new frequencies as more and more frequencies are freed up and auctioned off, and obviously moving into the support of new protocols and new deployment technologies. And a good example of that actually is when you look at LTE and you're moving from SISO to 2x2 MIMO type of deployment similar to 802.11n. You're going to get into advanced LTE. You'll go from 2x2 MIMO to 4x4 MIMO, and these are all, again, all about boosting the ability to deliver capacity and throughput on a wireless network. So from my perspective, I see that that's really what's next in DAS is pushing into these advancing technologies within the wireless networks. And I also think you're going to see more innovation in terms of the way that DAS is combined with other small cell technologies to deliver a really compelling solution, both from an economic and a performance perspective. When you look at the importance for indoor DAS performing at the DNC or the RNC, again, as I said, this is all about capacity and data throughput. So what you'll find in those venues is they're heavily sectorized, so that we can deliver adequate capacity to meet the needs of all of those people in those particular venues. A good example of that, for instance, is in 2008 at the Pepsi Center where the DNC was held at that time. We put a system into the Pepsi Center, and it had 24 unique sectors. Now, that Pepsi Center is a venue that seats about 20,000 people, maybe 18,000 for a Denver Nuggets or Colorado Avalanche game. But for the DNC, it required 24 unique sectors to ensure delivering adequate coverage and capacity into that facility. Now, when you look at what happened after the DNC at the Pepsi Center, that system actually shrank, if you will, to 6 unique sectors because the capacity requirement there wasn't as great for 18,000 people at a hockey game or a basketball game as it was for 25, 30,000 people at something like a political convention where you're going to get really, really heavy data use. And I expect to see even greater numbers this year because 4 years ago, the iPad wasn't really around, so you're seeing a lot more tablet technology. That's all data-driven. That's all capacity requirement.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, with these conventions as well, with the amount of press and everyone there, if there is any sort of a hiccup in the system, I'm sure we'll all hear about it one way or another. So anyway, well, maybe Ryan, maybe get your perspective. I know you've been working pretty closely in this field as well. Maybe get your view on kind of where we are right now in the indoor DAS market.
Sure. When about a decade ago, when I became involved with in building, it was really more of a cottage industry, and there's only 1 or 2 specific carriers that were typically just doing small deployments to really appease specific small scale and large scale clients. But what we're seeing now is obviously a full-blown growth to a nationwide play for really all of the major carriers, and that also includes enterprise clientele. And what we're also seeing is, as opposed to these solutions being carrier specific, for example, Sprint Nextel going in and only deploying a Sprint Nextel system, what we are seeing is the majority of major carriers are now deploying what we term, or commonly known as, neutral host systems, where one carrier would typically sponsor or jump on board first, if you will, to that neutral host, but it is built to handle both the coverage and capacity for additional carriers if they so choose to hop on. And from a growth standpoint, I'll agree with John. I think the quote unquote early days are behind us. And that's evident by the growth and spurt of the neutral host systems. And I think you're going to continually see DAS continue to evolve, not only as we're seeing right now with existing DASs that are currently being upgraded, for example, to handle additional frequencies such as Verizon's 700 LTE 4G or AT&T's 2100 AWS. Which may also support 4G speeds and 4G technology, but also upgrading those existing systems from CISO to MIMO. So not only from a frequency standpoint itself, but also deploying additional infrastructure and antennas to support that growth to MIMO to improve existing data speeds, which kind of leads me to the fact that, and I think we may all are starting to realize this if we haven't already, that data has become king. I really think with the prevalence of the internet and actually text messaging for that matter, voice. I think voice has become a lesser player to data, and that, as a side note, you may start to see that as reflected in your own individual plans with your carriers as they start to charge maybe more for that, and voice becomes more of a standby for that. What I've also seen is really a shift from BDA solutions, if you will, bidirectional amplifiers, to more a couple small cell plays such as the eFemto, which a couple specific carriers are deploying, and larger BTS scale implementations or backhaul. So we're really moving away, and John mentioned this earlier, from really appeasing clients from a coverage standpoint, but now both coverage and capacity. Offloading the macro network is becoming even more important, especially with major carriers that have deployed, for example, the iPhone in recent years. And I think we've all read about that and how carriers have properly responded to address those capacity issues. And so you're going to see, so the backhaul has really changed because a BDA, really is feeding off existing macro cell sites, whereas, and we may touch on this a little bit later, but eFemtos, for example, will leverage your existing internet backhaul, and BTS, which is more of a carrier type solution, is similar to the equipment that you would see at the bottom of a cell tower, for example, where there's recurring costs, T1, fiber optics hooked up to that. So DAS itself, as opposed to feeding off in the older days, if you will, to the existing macro, they're technically building new macro to support these in-building solutions. And from an RNC and DNC standpoint, and I think with our company alone, we've deployed, I want to say around 6 million square feet of hotel, convention, and public space between Tampa, which is obviously the RNC, and then Charlotte, the Democratic National Convention. And I'm actually based here in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I've been able to literally had a hand-in, if you will, implementation and integration of in-building solutions specifically for the major carriers that are trying to not really meet any coverage objectives, but really more capacity objectives. And obviously there's some RF design and planning that goes into that. I mean, because I think the RNC is expecting maybe around 50,000 visitors in Tampa, specifically for that event. The DNC, anywhere from 35, to 50,000 itself. And so, these dances are not only for the large stadiums, if you will, such as Carolina Panther Stadium, where I'm sure some specific event, DNC events will sure to be held, but also the hotels, for example, where the president, his staff are staying, to make sure that they have proper coverage and capacity there. And also includes really any other major venue that you can imagine where any DNC or RNC activity would occur.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, maybe Joe, maybe get I guess maybe a different perspective from you on kind of where the market is right now. I mean, obviously, I know you've been covering this space for a while and put out a number of reports recently on the space. So maybe you get some insight from you on the space right now.
You bet, yeah. So I think it's very interesting right now. If we go to the large question of really what is DAS, I think it's interesting to hear the perspectives of guys that are working in the industry. John and Ryan have a view of DAS moving from coverage to capacity, and that is absolutely what's going on. But as an analyst, I'm also covering the macro base station market and the small cell market, and looking at the big picture with different kinds of equipment. Everybody's moving in the same direction. Frankly, the source of money for all of us comes down to the mobile services and the operators that collect that money from end users, and that emphasis is shifting away from voice coverage to data capacity in all different spheres. What I find really interesting is that over the last 18 months, the macro base station market has declined. It's actually shrunk. Fewer base stations being shipped, fewer radio transceivers being deployed, and the amount of revenue going out there in terms of new capacity has actually dropped, even though the demand for data traffic has increased so dramatically. And what that tells me is that the operators are now shifting their focus. Instead of tower and power, putting up more and more towers and big amplifiers to just blast those signals around. They're focusing more on the indoor coverage, and we see strong ongoing growth in the DAS industry, as well as a lot of focus now on small cells for indoor capacity as well, to handle all that data traffic. So from our point of view, as an analyst firm, we're interested in following the money, and it looks like right now the money is starting to be redirected. When we try to look at the distinction between DAS and the rest of the industry, what what I find really unique about the DAS market is that it's a multi-operator system. And everything else that gets deployed is deployed by a single operator for their own service, except for those odd cases where operators share infrastructure. Typically a small cell or a macro base station would be deployed by one operator just for their own customers. And it's different in the case of DAS because with the DAS system, the building owner or the enterprise has a strong influence in saying exactly what equipment is installed. And often one of the top things on their list is that they don't want to have 5 independent systems installed for 5 different operators. So they force these in-building systems to be either a neutral host system or at least to have the ability to carry multiple operators. And that's why I think we see a shift in the investment here to go towards these DAS systems and away from towers to cover a lot of these public venues.
Yeah, that's a great point too. That's a good point because I do think that's something I'm going to cover a little bit later on as well. But yeah, the fact that these venue owners don't want to have multiple deployments in their buildings, so it's a challenge for them.
That's right. Yeah, just to follow up on one more point here, when you asked the question whether the DAS market is mature and stable, I think it's sort of like it has stabilized for one use case, but now the use case is changing. So around the world, we had a lot of passive DAS systems deployed, and you could say that there was a mature market for passive DAS. But now that we're going to data, and we have 2G, 3G, and 4G all coexisting, it's a disruptive time in the industry. So we are shifting, and the nature of the way the equipment is made will shift to more active fiber-based DAS systems as opposed to leaky coax or something else. And we'll need to do some of the innovative things that companies like TE Connectivity or CommScope or others do to digitize these signals and make it really compatible with a wide array of services.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Great. Well, thanks for the insight there. Before we move on to our second topic, I also want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please feel free to send those in using the question box there on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to get to some of those towards the end of this webinar. Looks like we have a few coming in already, so we'll definitely try to get to those a little bit later on. So well, moving on to our second topic here. I guess maybe take a look at, from your guys' perspective, kind of how does DAS fit into the overall indoor wireless ecosystem? I mean, obviously, we've already kind of talked about a little bit, about small cells, macro cells, femtocell, things like that. Maybe a little explanation or maybe a little background from you guys on kind of how you guys see DAS fitting into this overall plan for deployments when it comes to capacity and coverage. Maybe Ryan, maybe start with you. Maybe get some insights from you on how you see DAS fitting into this whole ecosystem for cellular.
Sure. As basically as an engineer, if you will, with the engineering background that I have, I think DAS continues to grow or evolve into a better fit inside the macro network. Once again, I think one of the items to note is that we used to typically deal with specifically just passive only systems. And when I say passive only, that term to me typically is just a donor antenna with a bidirectional amplifier and some coax with once again feeding off the macro network. But what we're starting to see is an evolution, in particular with the RF engineers, as we continue to shift away from feeding off the existing macro and start generating these DAS systems specifically with typically some sort of alternate backhaul, which in this case could be, once again, some style of internet eFemto backhaul, or more specifically a larger scale BTS backhaul, which is what we're seeing with most of these RNC and DNC deployments, where that backhaul is not shared with any other venues or with any sort of outdoor DAS. I'm seeing the evolution of RF engineers because once again, with that type of backhaul, you're going to have to start treating this just like a macro cell site that's going to have its own parameters, its own neighbors, an understanding of how it needs to properly hand off and work well with the macro. So you're looking as the DAS has become really an infill play, with the acknowledgement of the major carriers that this needs to be treated similar to a macro site, if you will. And data is now king, and really driving that capacity, and also driving that shift for specific carriers from more of a a CISO antenna structure to a MIMO infrastructure. And so we're seeing backhaul changes there. And just as a side note, we are also seeing Wi-Fi, carriers starting to implement Wi-Fi. And this may be more of a sidebar, but to actually even offload some of the DAS itself. So we're seeing a growth where you're having really three folks dancing in this party, where you've got Wi-Fi, the indoor DAS, and obviously the macro or outdoor DAS. And so once again, you're seeing the impact of data specifically to ensure that we are the carriers are achieving in specific really the 4G speeds that they are alluding to during their commercials and their marketing material. And that's one thing that we are heavily focusing on now, is to not only recognize that data is working, but it's meeting and exceeding specific uplink and downlink speeds to make sure that the client's experience is as advertised, if you will.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Joe, maybe a little insight from you, I guess, on kind of how you see this whole system fitting together. I mean, obviously you cover this space pretty broadly, from the macro all the way down to the femto micro level. How do you see kind of DAS playing in this whole ecosystem?
Well, I think it fills an interesting role because, in the past, what you've seen with DAS systems is has been sort of a side industry and more or less ignored by the top-tier OEMs. So if you wanted to install a DAS system in a casino in Las Vegas, for example, instead of getting some kind of customized equipment from the OEMs as a signal source, it tended to be one of their macro base stations, just straight off the same production line that you get your macro site from, and then they would put that in a room in one of the casinos and take that 100-watt output power and put a giant attenuator on it to drop that power down to feed into a fiber for the DAS. Mm-hmm. So it was really, I think, over many years, it was an industry where we took some pieces out of the cellular industry and adapted them for another use. And we didn't have access to signal sources, for example, that were really ideal for what John calls the small cell case. And I totally agree with his sentiment that it's, DAS has been small cells even before small cells were cool. It was, in the past, it was a way of taking that macro coverage or capacity and breaking it up into little small chunks and spreading them around. I think what's changing now is that the industry is developing small cell solutions which can serve as much more efficient from a power point of view, and also more cost-efficient signal sources, so that instead of having a big room full of base stations to service that casino in Las Vegas, we could have a single rack of equipment with maybe 4 or 5 picocells in a rack, and those would be putting out lower power levels. They would still have adequate capacity or similar capacity to what we had in the old DAS system, but it'll be much more well-suited to the right level of capacity for that casino application.
Yeah,
and I think that's going to be an interesting merger of two different ecosystems coming together with the small cells and the DAS.
Yeah, it does seem like overall, I mean, obviously with all these solutions available, maybe the trick to all this will be just the managing of these different inputs of connectivity. I mean, whether it's small cell or macro cell, bringing it all together could be the trick going forward. So, well, John, maybe get your insight a little bit on kind of your view on kind of the DAS and how it fits into this ecosystem as well.
Sure. I think DAS obviously is an excellent fit in the ecosystem. I believe its sweet spot is really kind of in the mid-range to larger venue types. You hear a lot about a discussion again in the press and other places regarding picocells. And you know, it's been my feeling that picocells are a good technology, but they still have some hurdles to overcome, and I think those have been discussed or touched on by the other panelists as well. I mean, generally speaking, picos are single frequency devices with a limited number of users in terms of their ability to handle simultaneous user capability. So when you need to go to a multiple frequency solution, a DAS is a great fit for that. And even less than multi-operator, what I'm talking about is an AT&T or Verizon who wants to deploy 850, 1900, 700 LTE, and AWS in a building. That's 4 distinct frequencies. Today there are no picocell devices that I'm aware of that support 4 frequencies out of a single device. Mm-hmm. So that means you're going to have to have multiple devices in each small cell within a building if you're deploying picos and the associated backhaul and all of that. Whereas to Joe's point, if you use picos to feed a DAS, it's a much more efficient and economical solution. Picos are right-sized from a power perspective to feed a DAS, and they're right-sized in terms of their size, the fact they don't have HVAC requirements, and the fact that the backhaul is inexpensive. Versus today's solution, which is a standard base station, where the base stations put out so much power it has to be attenuated into the end of a DAS, and all the power amps in that base station are causing heat and costing money. So I think DAS is a great fit in the ecosystem today. I think it fits well when you start looking at combining DAS with some of the, quote, small cell technology like picos or metro cells. And in fact, at the latest Mobile World Congress, we announced a capability where we were actually taking the baseband capability of a picocell and incorporating it into the head end of our DAS, because you don't need the RF capability out of a picocell. The DAS can handle the RF. So in fact, you're creating a DAS that's also a base station. Again, really compelling solution from an economics and an efficiency standpoint. And when you look at the question about data usage on cellular networks, we've all discussed it on this call to date, but there's some interesting things to consider, particularly when you're looking at some of these more high-profile events like the RNC and the DNC. It was reported, and the carriers keep this information fairly close to the vest, but for instance, at the 2010 NCAA Final Four basketball venue, Verizon reported a 400% spike in data usage at that event, which I believe was held in Indianapolis. So you can see just from that number what these kinds of events do in terms of driving data usage and capacity requirements in a network.
Yeah, it seems like these sort of venues, especially with the RNC and DNC, I mean, these things are tailor-made for a robust DAS solution. That's something that, you know, a smaller cell it's just not designed for something like that. So obviously for these types of venues, it seems like this type of solution it seems like the way to go for the carriers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, guys, let's get on to our final topic here before we get to the Q&A section at the end. Also want to remind those listening in that if you do have some questions for our panel members, you can use the question tab there in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to get to some of those at the end of the webinar here. So our final topic, I guess, is maybe looking a little bit at, I guess, some of the challenges for DAS right now. I mean, obviously, we touched on a few of those earlier, I think, with, you know, the fact that that venue owners might have some hesitancy to you know, making sure that these are multi-carrier kind of deployments, and there's also costs involved with putting these in, and obviously the impact of other small cell technologies on deployments. So maybe Joe, maybe start with you, I guess, on what you see kind of some of these challenges are, and if there are challenges that are solvable.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge that I see in the DAS industry is kind of a business model challenge. Okay. The technology is the easy part, but you know, when we get to looking at, when I do a 5-year forecast, for example, I have to think about, well, where is the growth going to come from? Yeah. DAS is sort of maturing along the lines of stadium cases or major venues, major events like the RNC and DNC conventions. And then getting into hotels and resorts, and what's interesting is, that there's a lot more buildings out there. There are, literally millions of buildings around the world, office buildings and residential high-rises and hospitals and smaller hotels that could really benefit from a DAS system. And the owner of that building would really like to have one, but frankly, all those building owners are looking toward the operators to make the investment. Yeah. So I think if we're going to have continued growth, in the sort of 20 or 30% range every year for the next 5 years, I'm wondering whether the building owners are really going to step forward and start to invest their own money to make sure that the cellular coverage and capacity is adequate in their facility. And I think that is happening to some degree with universities, with a few hospitals, with various different places, and I'm wondering just how far that's going to go. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges to the overall business growth in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, like you said, obviously traditionally people have looked to the carriers to foot the bill on these things, but that could be a changing model.
Right. My personal belief is, the data growth continues at nearly double every year. We're going to reach a point where in-building data capacity is really inadequate from a lot of the tower-based systems that we rely on right now. And the operators are going to be so busy just covering their top 10 venues in each city that all the rest of those building owners are going to be left out of the ROI calculations. They might contact one of the operators and hear that, well, your building just doesn't have enough traffic for us to get to it right now. Yeah. So I think there may be a point in time here in the next few years where the building owners step forward and start putting their own money into this game.
Interesting. Well, but maybe John, maybe I get some of your insight into kind of what you see for some of these challenges. Obviously, you're kind of on the ground level there, working with these. What do you see some of the challenges, and are they things that can be tackled?
Yeah, I think many of the things that Joe said are right on point. I think a lot of challenges in terms of, to answer the question, what's holding up deployment, is simply looking at what the business model is. Historically, the bulk of DAS systems have been funded and deployed by wireless carriers. You do see enterprises doing it, but on a very limited basis. But at the end of the day, the question is, what's the economic model for these? The big venues obviously are pretty easy to rationalize if you're a wireless operator. By big venue, I'm not just talking about places like the RNC and DNC or NFL stadiums, but I'm also talking about major airports, transportation hubs, those kinds of things, because it's obvious the kind of traffic that's being driven through those kinds of venues and what the economics of that are for the carrier. But when you move down into other spaces like the enterprise, it may not make as much sense from a carrier perspective to deploy a DAS or any solution for that matter, dependent upon who that customer is, how many users are in that particular building, what have you. But I think to Joe's point, we are seeing a move within the enterprise to say, you know what, every one of my employees is carrying a smartphone these days. Most people are actually either are displacing their wireline use with wireless use, and they need to make sure that there's adequate coverage and capacity. And oh, by the way, there are more and more applications coming on board for wireless devices to help productivity in a business. And I think, generally speaking, healthcare is kind of the canary in the coal mine for that. You see a lot of healthcare apps, but I think you're going to see it in other industries as well. So we are seeing enterprises more frequently putting out RFPs on the street and looking to actually fund systems. Now, some of the issues with the enterprise is, well, what frequencies do they need to cover? How much capacity do they really need in the system? What carriers want to participate in that system? And a lot of that has to do with the economics as well. So I think the challenges are solvable. I mean, the other issue is that, the other thing is that, the DAS industry, follows Moore's Law just as so many other high-tech industries. So you're going to see continuing costs come down in terms of DAS technologies and deployment. So that's also going to help. So I think that pretty much covers it in terms of what's happening out there. I do also think you do see cost sharing today. You'll see enterprises, for instance, donate, quote unquote, the fiber or the cable infrastructure for a system, and then the carrier put in the hardware, for instance. And those models are always easier to make it work for all parties as well.
Makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Well, Ryan, maybe I guess give you a final say on this topic here, what you're seeing and how these challenges are perhaps we can solve them.
Sure. So just quickly, so we can open up the Q&A here.
Sure.
But what I'm seeing on the street here is once again obviously the business model, and obviously not only the DAS cost itself. I think one of the other important considerations here is the RF source costing. Once again, as we shift away from these BDAs, which cost, let's call it a few $1,000s, you're seeing that once that backhaul shift, if you will, to an eFemto, which is a relatively inexpensive, solution relatively. But also, on the other hand, you have more of the large-scale BTS implementation where, number one, you've got recurring cost, with T1 and backhaul, and then actually the actual hardware costing, with large cabinets, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you have that point. And then also really just the feasibility of installation. I do agree that as technology, progresses, for example, with TE, that these solutions will become more and more streamlined. But obviously, pending the venue, there is the feasibility of installation within that specific venue. So what I'm also seeing here, so those challenges are solvable. We are seeing that carriers are, for specific large-scale venues, willing to, put up the capital. For example, for the RNC and DNC, spend the money to make sure that they're properly represented at each of these major venues during this important time. And we're also starting to see it on the enterprise side, where clients, understand that, well, if you want to implement a large-scale campus solution, eFemto or BDA backhaul, or RF sourcing is not going to cut it, and that there are significant costs included with BTS infrastructure. And so we are, with our own carrier coordination, because we have a specific team that handles that, we have seen some progress where both your end user or enterprise client is willing to share the costing for not only the DAS, but some of that BTS infrastructure, which is mission critical in order to accommodate and accomplish what you're trying to do with the DAS, which is both coverage and capacity. And we're seeing that growth specifically in two major verticals, in this case both healthcare and education. And so I think those are a couple key points with some of the challenges for deployment.
Sounds good. Well, Ryan, again, appreciate the information there. And like you said, yeah, we want to leave a few minutes here for Q&A. We've got quite a few questions in. I don't think we can get to all of them, but I think we can share these questions with our panel members for afterwards, for perhaps some follow-up. But yeah, so a couple of questions here. Maybe one of them looks like we got coming in. Someone asking about, I guess maybe the public safety aspect of this, whether it's we're looking for any sort of support from some of these DAS deployments for public safety, for 700 megahertz support. Is that something that's being looked at, or is that something that's supported now for some of these indoor DAS systems? I don't know if someone has some insight onto that there.
Hey, this is Ryan. I can at least initially address that. Yeah, we are definitely seeing an increase in public safety integration into cellular and PCS DAS, if you will, or carrier-specific DAS, where and as of right now, it seems to be bearing on whatever specific local ordinances are driving that public safety need. So obviously, if it's a well-known requirement within an specific area, such as a suburb of Chicago, we're seeing a lot of movement there, and other specific pockets within Florida, and really just throughout the U.S. And we're seeing significant growth with that. We're seeing implementation of anything from VHF to UHF to 700 and 800 public safety, on top of your standard 700 cellular PCS and AWS DAS, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody else had any comments. I know we got some specific questions to Joe on that as well too. And
this is John. If I can just chime in here. I mean, I think that Ryan that pointed out one of the key issues of public safety, which is right now public safety is a dog's breakfast of frequencies. It's at 150, 350, 450, or 300, 450, 700, 800, 900, and it's really driven by local municipalities about what is required. So that becomes kind of difficult to grapple with in terms of what is the actual need. I think once we get to the nationwide public safety frequency band and the 700 band, it's going to be much easier to deal with and much more transparent in terms of being able to deploy a solution for that. The other thing I would say is that you actually have to ask yourself, does it make sense to deploy public safety in the same system with your cellular infrastructure? Because if there is an issue and you lose it, you lose everything and all communications within the building. So generally speaking, our approach has been to deploy independent public safety systems.
Interesting, interesting. Joe, I don't know if you've seen any sort of a push on the public safety side when it comes to DAS at all, some of the stuff you've been covering?
Absolutely, I've seen it. What I've noticed is that the public safety guys, even though they don't have any money to deploy their own networks, they do have influence over a local municipality in their building codes and things like that. So they can dictate that in the city of anywhere USA. We need to have a public safety component included in every DAS system installed in our buildings, and often the city council will go along with that, and so you end up being forced to cover a lot of these frequencies, even in a system that's funded by one of the operators. So I think that's an interesting twist that's happening in the U.S. We also see a lot of integration of public safety in Europe, but when I look at the global market generally, the number of DAS systems that actually include public safety frequencies is actually still in the range of 25–30%. So it's not the majority around the world. It's really it's become a very strong driver in certain regions of the world.
Interesting. Well, okay, that's interesting to hear. So, another question. We've got quite a few here. I'm just going to kind of go through some of these. Someone asking about. I know we've kind of been talking about how DAS fits into the ecosystem. Maybe looking more at the small cell side of things, but someone's asking about how DAS coexists with remote radio heads. That is something that some of the carriers are trying to look at now, is kind of moving some of their macro sites, perhaps evolving their macro sites to a little bit smaller technology. I get from your point of view, how does DAS still kind of play the same role in that type of ecosystem as it does with the current traditional macro site ecosystem? That's, I guess, open for anybody there. I probably should, maybe Ryan, if you have a viewpoint on that.
Sure, we are starting to see a small uptick, at least specifically within the in-building world, with remote radio head, and I think one of the key components is really from both a cost and engineering side, because obviously with remote radio heads, in some cases there can be lower cost of deployment. With you're starting to minimize the number of active components that you have, and then from an engineering standpoint, is this one of the things where you're implementing in parallel with an existing DAS, or is this an add-on to a macro where it's directly linked back to some sort of cell tower or some sort of macro network? I think there's really just some engineering that needs to come into play. I haven't personally seen too many specific deployments of remote radio heads as of yet, but I do definitely predict an uptick, and I'm sure that the other panelists here can comment a little further on it. I am expecting an uptick as we kind of continue to evolve DAS with the remote radio head concept. Gotcha.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else has any comment on that section there.
I think there's an example happening right now in Korea where Korea Telecom has deployed a huge number of remote radio heads as a sort of a replacement for the BTS hoteling concept that they had in the past, where they had something called digital repeaters that they used. Yep. And so the numbers are staggering in terms of the number of lower power remote radio heads that they're using in building on some kind of an OBSI or CIPRI interface. And so I think that might be an indicator of what the future might hold, that there is an opportunity to take macro capacity over an OBSI or CIPRI fiber and feed that into a DAS system for a building. Or there may be some competition with the remote radio head simply itself being installed in the building.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Makes sense. Well, maybe we have time for maybe one more quick question on here. Looks like someone's asking about if a building owner is looking to invest in deploying their own DAS system inside their building, how can they be assured that that the carriers will get on board and make that investment that they're putting inside the building worthwhile for them? Is that maybe one of those challenges too that perhaps building owners are maybe a little fearful of putting their own investment in because they're not sure if they can get that return on their own investment into that deployment? I don't know, Joe, if you see anything on that.
This is John. I'd like to
John.
shot at that one. I mean,
yeah.
And I'm sure Joe has a perspective too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a concern to the building owners, and what they have to be assured of is that when they're considering putting a DAS system in, you need to bring the carriers in that they're interested in having on the system in right up front in the design process, because that's probably the biggest issue that they have, is that if they feel that the DAS isn't properly designed and it may, for some reason, interfere with the outdoor macro network or something like that, then the odds of them getting on that system are very, very low. Mm-hmm. The other thing, of course, is what their estimate of the number of users of their handsets or devices are within that particular building versus whatever their investment costs may be. Because regardless of whether or not the enterprise is funding the DAS, the carrier still has to fund the RF source for that system. In most instances these days, it's going to be some form of a base station, and we still see some repeaters out there. So really critical to involve the carriers right up front, really critical to have somebody on board who is very practiced in DAS design and understands what the needs are. And then that's another piece too, is to clearly outline what the requirements are in terms of frequency support, number of users or capacity requirement, and what the future needs of that DAS are too, so that it can easily be grown without causing a forklift upgrade.
That makes sense. Okay. All right. Well,
yeah,
that sounds good. Go ahead.
Really good inputs, John. I just wanted to add in here that I think you're totally right in saying that you have to involve the carriers up front. Looking forward, I'm pretty optimistic that the cost, once you have a DAS system in a building, the cost to add another carrier, for that carrier to provide some kind of a small cell signal source is coming down. So instead of providing an entire macro cell, as Ryan said, at $100,000 or more, we're looking at an initial capital investment coming down due to the integration of better chipsets, cheaper electronics to run the baseband for that capacity. So I think over time, as all the operators are pressed for capacity, I think more and more they'll take advantage of these kinds of DAS systems, and they'll want to jump on board. The question is making sure that they're all included in the discussion about the technical requirements so that the DAS system suits all the different operators' needs.
Yep, that makes sense. Well, great. Well, guys, we're running up to the end here on time. Definitely appreciate it. I want to thank, again, for all the questions that were sent in, and sorry for those that we did not get to. We will be sharing the list of unanswered questions with our panel members who, if time allows, can follow up with you individually on some of those questions too. Also want to let everyone know that this webinar will be archived on the rcrwireless.com site in a few days, and please look for our upcoming feature report on this subject on our site this week as well. So there should be some more information there for you guys too. I would also like to thank, before the webinar is over here, TE Connectivity as our sponsor for this webinar. Thanks again for helping us out with this, and again, thanks to everyone for participating today, and a special thanks to Steve, Ryan, and Joe for providing insight and on this topic, and thanks a lot everyone for dialing in. We definitely appreciate it.